Chapter 4. Turning to Fools and Madmen. As I plumbed the dimensions of dementia and the sources of its particular dread, my earliest memories of encountering mental disability, memories that had all but vanished, began to surface. They involved Diana, a girl who lived down the street from my family when I was a child. Seemingly out of nowhere, Diana would show up in our garage. Sometimes she would make it through the garage and into the kitchen. Her desperate moans, her high-pitched pleading voice often gave her away before we saw her imposing frame. She had grown large during early puberty, but her thin, straight white blonde hair had not changed. Her hybridity confounded me. She possessed the body of a full-grown woman and the fine hair and reasoning capacity of a toddler. No longer wearing her leg braces, perhaps they did not fit after her growth spurt, she walked with a limp, and she walked fast when she was determined. She would tear down our driveway, blowing past my dad, who was hunched over machine parts in the garage, and enter our house. From the bedroom or living room, my mom, siblings, and I would hear her heavy steps and raspy wail in the kitchen. We all knew what her presence meant. Diana had run away again. I was friends for a time with Diana's older sister, Tracy, in the way you become friends in elementary school, largely based on grade level and geographical proximity. We roller skated to music in her driveway, choreographing our favorite routine to Paula Abdul's Straight Up, Now Tell Me. On the rare occasions when we played inside, I recall her house as dark, the windows draped with heavy curtains and the walkout basement smelling of cat urine. I have few memories of Tracy coming to my house in retrospect. I can see that she had to stay close to home and help out with Diana, or to keep an eye on her baby brother, while her mother tended to Diana. Diana's soft features appeared unusually stretched, maybe a fraction of a centimeter, maybe the length of a mustard seed or two, separated her facial proportions from kids who weren't called retarded. It's the word we used for Diana, meaning no particular offense. At the time, my siblings and I knew that she was not like us, and that we should never mock her. My parents made that clear. But I now cringe at my use of such an insensitive term, which reduced her to her difference from us. Tracy once pulled out an album and showed me her sister's baby pictures. Diana had tubes taped to her red face. Even then, her face looked too broad. Tracy did not say a word about the reason for the tubes or why she wanted to show me. Diana's birth photos. Why I needed to see her troubling origins. It seemed as natural to her as roller skating to Paula Abdul tapes. I'm not sure even now why Diana would run away to my family's house in particular. We lived on the same street as Diana's family, but on the other end, a quarter of a mile or so from their house. Diana passed by many houses similar to ours, each plot nearly identical to the next, before she descended on our split level. Her mother, a heavy woman with dark, deep rings under her eyes, would often arrive a few minutes behind Diana, huffing in hot pursuit. After her growth spurt, Diana stood a head taller than her mother, who was not short herself. Now, with little physical leverage over her daughter, Diana's mother seemed even more exhausted, her eyes even more depressed. We looked down and waved off her apologies when she appeared at our house to fetch Diana, which was perhaps our Midwestern way of protecting Diana's mother and ourselves from embarrassment. As she goaded her daughter out of our house and back down the street, I did not know what Diana wanted with those visits. I never thought to ask her. Although I had witnessed her grow red in the face, shake her head fiercely, tears and snot flinging from her face, I never saw Diana turn violent. And to my knowledge, she had never harmed anyone. We said we were scared for Diana, scared for her to get hit by a car, scared for her to get lost, scared for her to get taken, scared for her to get scared, poor thing. She just doesn't know where she is. She gets so upset. She's so big now, so hard to manage. While she often appeared distressed, I wonder now if we failed to understand the true nature of her expressions, dismissing them out of hand as irrational, as unavoidable agitation. When she showed up at our house, I think we felt nervous. Not just nervous for her, but nervous for ourselves, about nothing we could define clearly. Madness seemed to intrude upon us, stalking us, showing up wailing in our family's driveway, garage, kitchen, a displaced yet known entity. Diana's unpredictable interjections into our lives felt unsettling, disrupting, even threatening. These impressions spoke to a deep and complex discomfort, internalized early, associated with mental difference. I have since noticed a similar nervousness that permeates at times interactions with people who have dementia. I am curious about this correspondence. In 1901, August Dieter was admitted to the hospital for mentally ill and epileptics. In 1901, August Dieter was admitted to the hospital for the mentally ill and epileptics, known colloquially as the Ehrenschloss, Castle of the Insane, in Frankfurt, Germany. Her husband did not know what else to do with his 51-year-old wife, who had apparently gone out of her mind. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Alois Alzheimer, studied her and kept careful notes. On November 29, 1901, 4 days after the patient's arrival, Alzheimer recorded in her medical chart, "During physical examination, she cooperates and is not anxious. She suddenly says, 'Just now a child called. Is he there?' She hears him calling. When she was brought from the isolation room to the bed, she became agitated, screamed, was non-cooperative, showed great fear, and repeated, 'I will not be cut. I do not cut myself.'" Earlier in that examination, when she was unable to complete a writing task, Alzheimer asked of her. She repeated the phrase, "I have lost myself." In Dr. Alzheimer's 1907 article on an unusual illness of the cerebral cortex, published a year and a half after August's death, he writes, "The first symptom the 51-year-old woman showed was the idea that she was jealous of her husband. Soon she developed a rapid loss of memory. She was disoriented in her home, carried things from one place to another, and hid them. Sometimes she thought somebody was trying to kill her and started to cry loudly." Shortly after August's death, Alzheimer, who was by then a researcher at the Royal Psychiatric Clinic in Munich, requested her file and had her brain sent to him. From slides of her brain tissue, he observed peculiar clumps of abnormal proteins and dense bundles of neurofibrils in the cortex. These beta-amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, whose exact role in the disease remains uncertain, are believed to block communication between nerve cells and contribute to their death. The patient, whom Dr. Alzheimer called August D., became the first person identified with the new brain disease. It was named after her diagnostician. The most common dementia-related disease was delivered into the halls of madness. It was a psychiatric patient in the Castle of the Insane that August Dieter became Alzheimer's first named victim. Alzheimer's disease, originally referred to as a presonal dementia, was a rare diagnosis in the first decades after its discovery. Because it applied only to people like August, whose dementia occurred before age 65, older people with the same symptoms were not given the diagnosis, under the assumption that their cognitive decline was simply normal for advanced age. This distinction dissolved in the late 1970s. The historian Jesse Ballinger's 2017 article, Framing Confusion, Dementia, Society, and History, explains this evolution. Through the work of a coalition of caregivers, family members, researchers, and government officials, the categories of senile dementia and Alzheimer's presonal dementia were combined into a single entity, Alzheimer's disease, and thus became a major public health issue. Contending for federal dollars, campaigns organized around this reframing of dementia were highly successful, writes Ballinger. By 1980, Alzheimer had become a household word and the object of a massive, federally funded research initiative. Despite these extensive research efforts now spanning over 4 decades, Alzheimer's disease remains poorly understood. The FDA has approved only 2 types of drugs, cholinesterase inhibitors and memetine, to treat the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Neither type stops the disease's progression. The National Institutes of Health defines dementia as the loss of cognitive functioning, thinking, remembering, reasoning, and behavioral abilities to such an extent that it interferes with a person's daily life and activities. A set of symptoms. Dementia is caused by a number of different conditions, including degenerative neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, vascular disorders that impede blood flow in the brain, traumatic brain injuries, and certain types of infections. Alzheimer's disease, the predominant cause of dementia, accounts for 60 to 80% of cases. Of course, dementia has not always been so clearly or narrowly defined. Before dementia became regarded as the product of disease in the 20th century, it was a broad concept associated with insanity and applied to those who exhibited psychosocial incapacity, disorganized behavior, or diminished ability to reason. In the decades following Dr. Alzheimer's discovery, the age-associated dementia we now know was steadily disentangled from this catch-all category. Nevertheless, through the first half of the 20th century, old people with dementia who were unable to live in their communities still were often linked to insanity and committed to state mental hospitals. They became one of the largest segments of the patient population. Dementia's etymology, out of, mentia, the mind. Reflects roots in madness. And the extent of madness stigma is vividly, if grotesquely, reflected in the treatments used upon people deemed out of their minds. Foucault's classic History of Madness and the sociologist Andrew Scull's contemporary work on madness elucidate this long and unsavory history. In pre-modern Europe, madmen were often bound in chains, kept in cold, dank cells, and subjected to all manner of cruelty. In the hope of exorcising insanity's source, purported to be possessed by evil powers, the madman was deemed to be overflowing with invading spirits, legions of them. After overtly religious explanations and cures were abandoned, practices of sanctifying madmen endured in the form of medical procedures and moral censure. Common medical treatments of the 17th and 18th centuries included immersing maniacs in ice water, using blood transfusions as a remedy for melancholia, having madmen ingest soap and tartar, and soaking patients in vinegar. Some performers of those eras made a turn toward moral approaches. They utilized what became known as the silent treatment, including the use of solitary confinement to urge sufferers towards a state of reflection, and they hoped self-correction. In the 19th century, new technology promised new routes to healing. A rotary device rapidly spun patients who were strapped in a suspended chair, often to the point of nausea and incontinence, as a means to restore their mind-body equilibrium. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who is sometimes called the father of American psychiatry, created a special tranquilizing chair designed for sensory deprivation. He also recommended bleeding and purging patients and the ingestion of mercury. In the 20th century, pharmacological interventions rose to prominence. By 2013, 1 in 6 Americans and 1 in 4 older adults reported taking a psychiatric drug, according to data gathered by the Medical Expenditure Panel survey. And while these drugs are a far cry from bloodletting and ice water baths, their side effects can be severe, ranging from emotional numbness and suicidal ideation to sexual impotence and metabolic disorders. As I mentioned previously, the risky off-label use of psychotropic drugs with people who have dementia is common as a means of managing certain behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, such as anxiety, agitation, and depression. Some person-centered care activists, such as Alan Power, reject the category of BPSD. Reviewing people through the lens of BPSD asserts Power, causes us to medicalize and pathologize the expressions of people living with dementia. While some people with dementia may legitimately need medication to treat a mental illness such as depression, Power maintains that these drugs too often are administered under a misguided notion that they are necessary to quell signs of distress, rather than address the source of people's distress and holistically support their well-being. We resort to dangerous chemical interventions. The long-standing cultural impulse to segregate and suppress people who are cognitively different may account for some of dementia's present-day stigma. Of course, we now understand dementia as the product of disease, not a form of madness, and thankfully have abandoned the cruelties of, say, spinning chairs and sensory deprivation therapies. Nevertheless, the taint of madness persists and may explain some of dementia's dread. Dementia activates our deep-seated fears of going insane. Kitwood posits, because it confronts us with the terrifying prospect of unbeing, of the corrosion of one's sense of self, this largely unconscious dread might explain, at least in part, the highly defensive ways in which we often respond to people with dementia. Left buried and unaddressed, these fears generate negative patterns of relating to these people. Kitwood's malignant social psychology, which he warns functions to exclude those who have dementia from the world of persons, and which at times might accelerate their mental decline. But what particularly about going insane engenders fear and malignancy toward people who represent mental instability? Some clues may lie in how conceptions of madness function to stigmatize the mad. According to the sociologist Irving Goffman, once stigmatized, a person is reduced from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one, and thus is readily excluded from the world's persons. The madman, says Foucault, crosses the frontiers of bourgeois order and alienates himself outside the sacred limits of its ethic. He acquires stigma, becomes tainted and discounted through his compatibility with bourgeois order, that is, white, upwardly mobile social norms. He is irreformably inefficient and entirely unremarkable. No matter its source, madness is trespass, an unauthorized border crossing from the land of prudent productivity into the land of reckless idleness. those who have transgressed, those who have lost their minds from birth, Diana, or sometime after August, violate the sacred limits of industrial order, which narrowly calculates human value by our capacity for mechanistic production and conspicuous consumption, unable to maintain respectability in this schematic, lacking both efficiency and potency. The mentally disordered are punished by the order they unwittingly defy. Persons with dementia have acquired a cognitive disability. My friends in disability circles sometimes remind me. They become initiated into the stigma that others who were born with brain impairments have suffered their entire lives. All those whose brains are considered damaged or otherwise abnormal endure a similar process of outcasting. It seems a social response that demands scrutiny. Perhaps, especially as a surviving incarnation of madness, dementia haunts us with the specter of helplessness, irretrievable social demotion, and indelible stigma. Dementia threatens the myth that personal hard work and ingenuity can overcome obstacles. While some fatal diseases can be enabling, bravely battled or stoically accepted, leaving respectability untouched or even bolstered, Alzheimer's and other dementia-related diseases in the popular imagination spell unmitigated tragedy. Even when we know more about the pathology of brain disease, and even when we claim to be beyond assigning moral meanings to illness and disability, dementia remains a special case of violation. It is not only physically and mentally debilitating, but also socially devastating. Elderly persons with dementia are at risk for what sociologists call social death, a condition in which people are treated for all practical purposes as if they are non-existent. In their 1997 landmark study on dementia and social death, the psychologists Mary Gilhooly and Helen Sweeting observed that the determining factors for social death often coalesce in people with dementia, advanced age, lengthy fatal disease, and loss of personhood, commonly linked to the ability to recognize